Hi, everybody. We're going to do a run through of a very important point, which is how to have a difficult conversation. It's based on an excellent book put out together by Patton Heen, their book, Difficult Conversations. So, the dilemma with any difficult conversation is whether to avoid it, walk away, or confront it. Think of your neighbor who has a dog that's barking all night. The first night, you'll say, well, okay, maybe not a big deal. Second night, you start to think, should I confront? The third night, you start thinking, I think I need to. But then you think again, what if that person gets mad, hostile? What if they think less of me or judge what I do or become a threat even to my own personal safety? So the whole idea is that we often feel it's a hand grenade situation. And we think, my God, there's no way to deliver a diplomatic hand grenade. The problem on the opposite front, of course, with avoiding is that tact is good, but it's not the answer. And ultimately, the problem with this kind of understanding of a difficult conversation is that we're equating it to delivering a message. In other words, I walk over to the neighbor and I confront the neighbor and I tell them the truth. That's the idea of the hand grenade. The option is to move instead toward a learning conversation. And according to Stone, Patton, and Heen, you build a learning conversation by seeking to understand what is both said and not said. So often there's a sense of emotion that's rafting on waves right while you're trying to convey an idea, right when you're trying to review what you think is factual, what happened, if you will. And he said, the authors, I should say, said the means is first to identify that every conversation has three subtypes, three different conversations that are sort of floating around like those rafts up and down a wave. It's the first is a what happened conversation. A what happened conversation is often trying to determine, obviously, the who, what, where, when, why, but it's often fraught with implications. And we'll talk more about this, but it's fraught especially with the idea of who has the right facts or whether or not we have all the facts. The second conversation that's going on often at the same time as one's discussing facts is the feelings conversation. The subpoints here are whether or not your feelings or their feelings are valid and whether and how to acknowledge the other person's feelings. The third type of conversation is the identity conversation. And this has to do with the way you perceive yourself. So, for example, let's say you're having that conversation with the neighbor about the barking dog. You're not comfortable. And perhaps part of the reason you're not comfortable is because you want to be perceived as a good neighbor. Perhaps you grew up in a type of culture where this kind of confrontation was perceived as rude. This was perceived as an attack or even aggressive, right? As such. So an identity conversation has to do with your self-perception. That's the conversation you have with yourself about the way you'll be perceived and really about your own sense of self-worth and self-image. So how do we get out of the pickle here? And let's do so by looking at a scenario. We need to avoid traps. I'm going to read an excerpt from their work. In their work, they talk about a scenario where Jack is a graphic artist and Michael is a client. Michael calls in a frenzy and says, I need a financial mocked up and presented for my client by tomorrow. Can you do it? And Jack, knowing Michael, liking Michael, having worked with him, says, maybe awkwardly, yes. And what proceeds, of course, is that Jack drops everything and sends the proofs of the brochure to Michael. Michael looks at them in the morning, but because, of course, he's under time pressure, figures Jack's good to his word, good to what he does, and sends them on to have them printed. And then he gets a voicemail. Jack gets a voicemail from Michael that says, "Hey, what happened? It's a total screw up." Basically, it says, "You really screwed this one up, Jack. I know you're under time pressure, but the earnings chart isn't presented clearly enough. It's just simply off." And so Jack picks up the phone and calls back Michael. And here's a bit of the conversation. "Hey, Michael, I got your message." Michael says, "Yeah, look, Jack, this thing has to be done over." Back to Jack. Uh, well, I agree it's not perfect, but the chart is clearly labeled, but nobody's going to misunderstand. "Come on, Jack," says Michael. "You know as well as I do, we can't send that thing out like it is." Jack, "Well, I think that there's really nothing to argue about," Michael says, cutting him off. "Look, we all screw up. Just fix it and we'll move on." Jack says, "Well, why didn't you say something about this when you looked at it this morning?" Michael, I'm not the one who's supposed to be proofreading, Jack. I'm under tremendous pressure to get this thing done and get it right. Look, you're either on the team or not. I need a yes or no. Are you going to redo it? And then Jack, with a long pause, says, all right, I'll do it." And you can see in that conversation the freight of emotion that's going on. Certainly the way things are rafting up, there's a lot of pitch and a lot of things unsaid. For example, can Jack really state, "Hey, I was up all night, we've been buddies, but this is out of touch, this is strange, and this is 24 hours. And then Michael saying, "Well, of course, but you said yes," right? So you have these emotional loaded thoughts. So there are a couple assumptions that happen with traps of this sort. One is a truth assumption. There's only one right. And in the last example, we realized there isn't one right because both Michael and Jack have a point. Um, we don't see everything perfectly from the right perception. And I think the book does a fantastic job of really getting us into this idea of right and wrong. So let me read this, and I just think again it's worthy. "What are you right about?" "Well, you're often right about, the brochure is fine as it is, or is it, right? And the hitch, as they say, is that you're not, quote, right." And we'll put that word right in quote marks. "How can it be?" "The point is that difficult conversations are almost never about getting the facts right. They're about conflicting perceptions, interpretations, and values. They are not about what a contract states as much as what a contract means." And I'm going to add the words "as much" because there's still a technicality of the language. And some would say sometimes language can have a fairly robust sense of truth. Mind you, think of a legal situation. Still, even with legality, there's perception. Let me go on. "They're not about what child rearing book is most popular. They're about what child rearing book we should follow." Let's go back to Jack and Michael. "There is no dispute about whether the graph is accurate or not. They both agree it is not. The dispute is whether the error is worth worrying about, and if so, how to handle it. These are not questions of right or wrong, but questions of interpretation and judgment. Interpretations and judgment are important to explore. In contrast, the quest to determine who is right and wrong is a dead end." In the "what happened" conversation, moving away from the truth assumption frees you to shift your purpose from proving we are right to understanding the perception, interpretation, and values of both sides. It allows us to move away from delivering messages and toward asking questions, exploring how each person is making sense of the situation, and to offer our views as perceptions, interpretations, and values, not truth. The exploration of what is important and getting perhaps deeply into the idea of values and deeply into significance. All right, the second point here of a trap is the intention. I mean, was Michael a jerk for calling Jack so late and imposing? Certainly the conversation seems to hint that he was at least aggressive. Or was he truly under pressure and he paid Jack well and he expected Jack to come through? Do we know all these things from the top of a conversation, even from me having read it? Did we interpret or kind of, if you will, use our own cultural, experiential grid to kind of come in at it with emotional freight from our having had an experience similar to Jack or to Michael. Wow, I got screwed once by a boss, if you will, and Michael's a jerk. All right, third, blame frame, and this really wraps all the other two into it. The undue focus, again, on let's find out who did it wrong and tell them to fix it. We deliver the message. It's a mailman knocking on the door, handing over that document, slapping it even in their hand, and turning around saying, read it. Third, apply strategies. Let's go positive. Let's go back into intent. Let's explore. So realize difficult conversations are at the core about feelings. They're about trying to express, and they're trying to say there's significance in each other. Sometimes you have to establish a baseline of understanding that there's dignity and that a person is not going to be threatened at their core value. This wraps very closely with identity because there has to be a security, especially as a boss or supervisor working with an employee. Because immediately there's the freight of, well, I can pull rank on you, I can fire you, I can demote you. And so that notion of power and the power structure can very quickly, as we know, be abused. And the flip side of that, you fire a person that was really worth being there, wow, not so good for the organization, right? So why not come at it first with the idea of, could this be worked through? We all know there are conversations that have to be dead ends, where there has to be a kind, firm, but pointed saying that this won't work out. The situation of working together is not working out. Even there could be constructive. But we are at the core about feelings, and we are also about identity. Then realize that you might need to front with yourself, almost do a catalog of your own sense of what's going on here. Sometimes we don't step back one notch before picking up the phone to say, hey, how do I possibly feel threatened? Or how is my self-image part of this structure? We think this might be too much psychology, but according to Stone, Patton, and Heen, this is core. This is helpful. This is constructive. This moves you along and them along and allows for a sort of a character growth, if I could use the word character. The idea of self-image, maybe you grew up being perfect, so everyone has to like you and all situations have to work out, and it's Disney with a theme song at the end. Maybe it's the hero you're rescuing, right? And you are always a good rescuer. And so if you don't come through rescuing the situation properly enough, then you're just not good enough. This could be Jack, right? With being the contractor, working for others, just having to get that product out, have to do backflips for them. If they want a backflip, I do a one. If they want two, I do two. Being kind. Kind is an abused word, right? We know the word nice. There's even whole books written on Mr. Nice Guy. It's literally a title of a book. Being nice, being kind equals, in our culture, often being run over, right? And so the idea of identity. And they're positive to these. I hope to God we all are kind and we all at least strive for a sense of perfection. I don't know about, again, relentless pursuit of perfection was a saying of Lexus, was one of their ad marketing tropes. And we all should hopefully be a hero in some situation, to our family at least. But it's the idea of wrapping a lot of identity in it. And sometimes the wrapping of our past can really influence the ability to kind of come out of that situation and have the conversation. So this all comes down to not delivering the mail, and we've already talked about that. So going back to the third very briefly, realize difficult conversations are about feelings, identities at play, and you're not delivering the mail. Let's get past delivering the mail. So being collaborative means taking the mindset you're seeking a way to work together to figure out how to manage the problem going forward. My apology for the typo. Problème, I don't know, maybe I'm going with a different language here. How can we manage the problem going forward is a great way to frame something. How can we seek a way to better it? Because the situation is just a blip. And that's the other thing. Think of it as a blip. Yeah, it could be major, right? It could be a pretty big blip because it's a big client, let's say. But can we overcome this? Can we build around this? Can we have an optimism that says we could double earnings even if we lost this client? Yeah, we could. So the idea is you always come back and say, are we worth it? I mean, it's not only is the situation somehow bracketed in the scheme of a long view, but also you're looking at the person saying, we're worth it. This is worth it. The conversation's worth it. Explain your point of view in neutral terms. Very hard, but the I is, of course, the big statement. You know, I perceived, I thought this happened. You're not accepting, you're not blaming, you're not saying they're great. You're not trying to say, you know, I love you in this situation. You did great here and here and here, but this was a screw up. You're not trying to butter, you know, put on 5 pounds of butter on the piece of bread before you make them choke down something that's really tough, right? Um, it's perception, it's interpretation again. Try to understand what happened from the other person's point of view. Very tricky because you can go into interrogation mode. Oftentimes supervisors will trip over this. So they'll start with, hey, Jack, do you know why I called you into this meeting? That's a loaded question, right? Jack has to kind of stumble because it's almost like a legal situation. Often teachers will do this, right? Because it's a tactic to get the other person to admit a fault. And therefore, once you have the fault, now you have the leverage. So it becomes a game more of blame. Let's just get this rooted out. Now, asking questions is not wrong. And at some point, obviously, to establish perceptions, you have to. And it could be open-ended, but it's when and how that question is approached. If it's the first thing and you're sitting behind your desk and that person is sitting in that little small chair with no arms in your office, right? You asking the question, what happened, is a power move. And maybe, you know, you might think it's okay. Like that's what you got to do. And we're saying here, might be a better way. Try to understand what's happening from the other person's point of view. Share your feelings often up front. A tactic that I like to use often in my conversations. So we all have fights, right? We have fights with our loved ones. And how can we get out of them? Well, coming out with the perception, hey, I'm not sure exactly what happened here with the kitchen being a mess and people not putting things away in COVID. But son, right now, Gabe, hey, I got a lot on my plate right now. I'm prepping for 7 classes and I'm not sure how we can talk this through. Um, Getting a little bit feeling like things aren't being taken care of. That's my own perception, my own feeling. Do you know where I'm coming from? And so somehow trying to establish a rhythm of waves that are running together, right? We get our feelings kind of rolling together. So he could say, do you know where I'm coming from, is an invitation to kind of acknowledge back. Now it's careful how you load it, right? You better have some other prehistory, right? I hope I've got prehistory with my son that is positive, all right? That's the other thing. You got to have equity in the bank if you're going to get in and through these difficult conversations. All right, we share them, and if there's a policy, we sometimes reference it. This all comes back to our scenario that we're going to be looking at in this class. I'm not going to go into it in depth, but you'll see a scenario where you sometimes need to go to what I call thirding. Thirding with a client, let's say you have no relationship, or a customer who comes in complaining about a product, is to say, I can do this, while I can't do this, I can do this. And we're going to talk about that shifting in other lectures. But the idea of thirding often will involve bringing in a policy. Now, you know, according to store policy, I can't do this, but I can do this. So you always flip it back to what you can do rhetorically, but you're also using the policy as the point of reference so that it's not you versus the customer, you versus the client, but you working with the policy and acknowledging, hey, in an orderly world, we have laws, we have policies. Got to be careful with this in the scenario here with Michael and Jack, or if you're a supervisor with the big desk between you and the person. Hopefully you don't have that small chair. Yeah. All right. In sum, you invite the person into a conversation. We're figuring things out. We're collaborating. We're alongside each other. And that's the point. You're trying to get from a hierarchy. And why not? This is outside my house. Hope you enjoy it. All right. I'm going to try to come out of this. I don't know how to stop my lecture. Oh, I love this because when I'm in this mode, here we go. All right, guys. We are stopping recording. Thank you, and we'll catch you on another lecture or in class.